Energy is quite literally the future. If we want any sort of a prosperous future, we desperately need an energy source that is abundant, cheap, and clean. For all of human history, every time there's been a giant leap forward in terms of prosperity and growth and wealth and health, it's been enabled and fueled by a new energy source. Further than that, energy is so tightly correlated with GDP growth globally that they're essentially the same thing. So what if I were to tell you that an energy transition like we've experienced just a couple of times in human history is happening right now? And not only is this new form of energy production far superior to fossil fuels in terms of its energy density, it is also far superior to renewable forms of energy like solar and wind in terms of how clean it is and its total environmental and carbon footprint. And finally, despite common misconception, this new energy source is also the safest form of energy production by far. Yes, I am talking about nuclear. Now, I don't care if you don't believe climate change is real or if you're an environmental activist. There's going to be something I say in this video that is going to offend you. But I'm not going to present opinions. I'm only presenting facts here. And the conclusion of all the facts that we're going to look at today should be tremendously exciting to everybody. This is good news we're talking about here. We're going to go over why nuclear is superior to all other forms of energy production by leaps and bounds, not even by a small margin. How the world is slowly waking up to these facts. How an inevitable boom in nuclear energy is right around the corner. Why this is unbelievably good news for global health, wealth, prosperity, growth, the environment, and population. And finally, how you can get in on the ground floor and invest in this new industrial revolution before this nuclear explosion. Figuratively speaking, of course. Ready? Let's dive in. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown, and we all know, everybody agrees that energy is vital. That's not up for debate, and nobody argues with that. What people do disagree about is the best way to get their hands on energy, or the best way to produce energy for themselves or for the world. If you look back through time, you see that humanity transitions from forms of energy that are matter dense to forms of energy that are energy dense. Now, in the beginning, think wood. This was the primary form of energy production, was just burning wood as fire. Now, obviously, fire was a tremendous leap forward in technology. Fire allowed humanity to extract a greater amount of nutrients by cooking food. That made them healthier, made them live longer, made them less reliant on extracting so many resources out of the world, because you could get more resources out of one carrot that's cooked than you could out of eating 5 raw carrots. Greater health, because you weren't as exposed to harmful bacteria or things when you eat raw meat. You could cook it. It allowed people to warm themselves so you could expand out into other environments that were maybe colder that you couldn't live in without fire. And it gave them light, which allowed them to extend their work hours and be more productive into nighttime and do things at dark that they couldn't have done before. So fire allowed people to utilize resources more efficiently and more effectively than they could before. But obviously there are downsides to humanity relying exclusively on wood as the only source of energy, right? You've got deforestation that happens. That's bad. That causes the killing off of many plant and animal species that rely on those forests and those trees being there. And obviously the smoke kills people, right? When you have the entire human race living just off of fire, you end up having people die from breathing smoke their entire life. Well, the next great leap forward in terms of energy production came when people realized coal was a good source of energy. It allowed the invention of the steam engine, which paved the way for the Industrial Revolution to make leaps and bounds in prosperity and growth and health and wealth all over Europe. Greater global transportation, access to markets all around the world that we didn't have access to before. Remarkable leaps and bounds in progress. Were there downsides to coal? Of course, nobody argues that, but it was far better than the alternative. Otherwise, nobody would have used it. The next great industrial revolution happened during the 1800s in America when we discovered fossil fuels, when we discovered oil and started making things like natural gas and gasoline. The invention of the internal combustion engine, things like that led to another great leap forward in terms of transportation, access to new technologies that allowed humanity to make another leap forward, and it gave greater prosperity, greater wealth, and access to new technologies that the world otherwise would not have had. No more relying on deforestation. You can just drill and get energy out of the ground. How amazing is that compared to what was before it? No more miners dying in coal mines. No more black lung. So every time we've had a great leap forward in energy production, it has made energy cheaper and more accessible and cleaner and more environmentally friendly to the world than the last. That's a fact. And a couple interesting things happen when countries get richer. Number one, local pollution disappears. As countries get richer, their pollution and their environmental impact actually goes down. The poor historically are the last ones to get their hands on new forms of energy, and so as countries get richer, the poor have more access to the newer and cleaner forms of energy. This means the people in these countries get healthier. Now you might be thinking, hey, that's bad for population, but it's actually not. For most of human history, our average lifespan has been about the same. The reason why we say that, a couple hundred years ago the average lifespan was 40 is not because people usually died at 40, it's because the infant mortality was so high, it skews the numbers, it skews the averages. If you lived past being a kid, you had almost the same chances of living to 78 as you do today. And so for most of human history, the birth rate was still 2 or 3 kids. It was just that you had to have 12 kids in order to have 2 or 3 of them survive. Nowadays, most kids survive, so parents only have 2 to 3 kids, because you don't need to have 12 in order to have 3 of them survive. You only need to have 3 to have 3 survive. This means that there's a transition period where the culture has to get used to, we are healthy enough that our kids aren't dying anymore, so we don't have to have 12 kids to have 3 of them survive anymore. And so you get population explosions as countries go through transitions where they go from poor and unhealthy and dying to rich and healthy and staying alive. Which means that if we want to stabilize global population and we don't want it to grow to 100 billion, you actually have to get countries to get rich and healthy, because that means they'll stop having 10 and 12 kids. Just by themselves, no government mandates necessary. It's just what happens naturally. And if we want to make people in countries rich, one of the necessary ingredients is access to clean, cheap, and abundant energy. And that next energy leap is happening right now with nuclear. And it's a good thing too, because the coming energy demand, the expected demand for how much energy our global population is going to need over the next couple of decades is absolutely monstrous. It's enormous. Far greater than our current energy production can meet. But let's say that wasn't the case for a minute. Let's say hypothetically, we had the ability to use the energy source of the last century to be able to supply all the needs for the future. Well, there'd be some downsides to that, right? Number one, you've got carbon emissions. It's estimated that up to 9 million people every single year die from something that's related to pollution or carbon emissions. But even if you don't believe that, if you think, hey, those causes are not the causes, that led them to die, those are maybe just contributing factors, or those numbers are wildly overestimated, fossil fuels are still a finite resource. Oil came from plants and animals that at one point in time got put underground. And even if, and this is largely debated in the scientific community, even if the oil is being replenished through natural processes and it wasn't just a one-time cataclysmic event that formed all the oil, we're still using it up at a far faster pace than it is formed at the fastest estimations that our world could produce new oil underground. So no matter which way you look at it, at some point, and we don't know when, we will run out of fossil fuels. It's a guarantee. It's a matter of when, not if. And so alternative forms of energy, alternative sources of energy are being looked at out of necessity and a desire for a better future, because the more energy we can get, the better off everybody will be. So obviously one of the biggest forms of new energy that is on everybody's mind right now, especially because of the green initiatives in many countries around the world, is solar. And one of the reasons for this is because if you look at all the energy that hits the world from the sun in a given day, that's about the same amount of energy as our world uses in an entire year. And so it seems as if the amount of energy coming from the sun that we have access to is enough for at least a couple hundred years. As long as we can figure out a way to access that energy, that would be good, clean, renewable source of energy for us. But there's some problems with this. Number one, let's say hypothetically we were able to devise a solar panel array that completely absorbed all solar energy that came from the sun that was gonna hit the earth. You would kill all life on Earth. because a lot of that sunlight, we need it to hit the earth in order to have plants grow, which enables animals to live, and in order to have weather, which produces rain, you need the sunlight to hit the earth. And so there are scale limitations there to how much solar energy we can safely convert into electricity without itself having a negative impact on destroying our ecosystem, our global ecosystem. Further than that, even if that wasn't the case, there are actual physical limitations on photovoltaic cells that make up solar panels. They max out at about a 33% efficiency, and our current best technology solar panels get like 26 or 27% efficiency from sunlight. And so we simply don't even have the physical capabilities to absorb all of the energy that the sun sends our way, even if we wanted to. On top of that, solar panels have about a 20 to 30 year lifespan, which sounds great until you realize that solar farms require destruction of many animal habitats and massive amounts of land in order to install solar farms. They're made up of toxic chemicals that have to be discarded, that don't just erode and go away when they're discarded at the end of their life. We need to develop new technologies in order to be able to recycle them. And by 2050, at our current pace, solar panel waste will be double that of all plastic waste put together so far. And because of the immense amount of resources that are needed in order to produce solar panels, you have massive ecological disruption when you have to go mine all of those materials out of the ground in order to produce those solar panels. Add on top of that the fact that solar panels are really not energy dense at all. And so in order to provide enough energy to supply the electricity that the world uses right now, in 1 year, you would have to cover the entire state of Nevada in solar panels. And if we were able to achieve a monumental industrial feat like that, deploying solar panels at that scale with only a 33% maximum efficiency means that most of that solar energy is converted then into heat, which causes its own ecological system to erupt and just emerge out of nowhere. And if you were to do this in somewhere like the Sahara Desert, the heat that it would produce would actually green the Sahara Desert and turn it into a rainforest. Rain and trees would grow over the solar panels and render them useless. Add on to that the fact that solar panels, we know that that fossil fuels kill, let's say 9 million people a year. Solar panels kill 440 people every single year. And this is, of course, across the whole end-to-end production and life cycle of solar energy, but still, there's a human life cost associated with it. So solar panel, the end-to-end environmental and carbon footprint is better than fossil fuels, but it's nowhere near ideal. And the logistics of relying on solar to provide the energy needs of the future because of its energy density and its materials requirements is simply unrealistic. Now, the other thing that people are looking at right now is wind. The problem with wind is that it's even less energy dense than solar. Windmills still only have a 20 to 30 year lifespan, and now we have literal graveyards, massive areas of land that they're just burying old windmills and turbines because there's nowhere else to put them. There's nothing to do with these massive wings. They don't break down, they don't erode, and so we're just burying them, creating massive landfills of broken windmills. Windmill farms are killing off endangered species of birds. It's not the birds that are killed in cities like pigeons from things like cats, but the windmill farms, they're actually killing off endangered species of birds and putting other species of animals into risk of becoming extinct, like bats. And so there are massive environmental impacts from doing things like solar and wind. Not to mention the human life aspect of wind, which itself kills about 150 people every single year. Now, the kicker here is that wind and solar are variable sources of energy that are not on demand. So something like natural gas, you can look at natural gas and say, okay, that's a variable source of energy because you can turn it on, you can turn it off, it goes up and down. But natural gas is on demand. You can choose when to do that. Solar and wind are variable. Sometimes they're producing max power, sometimes they're producing zero power, but they're not on demand. You can't choose when the sun's out and you can't choose when the wind blows. And so this is why companies that are heavily invested in solar and wind are also heavily invested in natural gas, because solar and wind being operational are reliant on fossil fuels in order to be able to supply the energy needed during the valleys and shut those energy sources off during the peaks of wind and solar. So all things considered, when you look at the total carbon footprint, the environmental impact, the abundance and access to cheap clean energy, is wind and solar, are they better alternatives than we've had in the past? You can make a good argument that they are. Are they sufficient for the future? Not by any stretch of the imagination. And can we do better? Oh, so much better. Enter nuclear power. Nuclear is the hated and the feared word of the 20th century. It conjures up images of apocalypse and zombie movies and end-of-the-world scenarios. Fortunately, that's all fiction. Yes, all of it. So let's deal with some of the objections by looking at the facts. Objection number 1, it's dangerous. Well, let's see. There have only been 3 nuclear accidents in history. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. That's it. Guess how many deaths end-to-end nuclear energy production has ever caused in the history of nuclear energy production? 200. Wind kills 150 people a year. Solar kills 450 people a year. Fossil fuels kill up to 9 million people a year. Nuclear, 200 ever. Okay, I said it was dangerous. I didn't say it killed people, so what about radiation? Well, the production process for creating uranium that is used as fuel in nuclear power plants creates about as much radiation to the people working there and around there and living nearby as a banana. That's right. You get the same level of radiation from a banana as you do from nuclear power generation. You say, okay, but that's in a normal circumstance. What about when there's accidents like meltdowns? Again, 3 of those have ever happened in history. They were all black swan events that were a result of really old technologies that hadn't been maintained. And on top of that, multiple things all went wrong at the same time. And accidents with things like this are what's known as anti-fragile. It means every time one of these happens, the likelihood of another thing like that happening again in the future just plummets. It's like every time a firefighter dies, what they do is they look at exactly how the firefighter dies and they come up with widespread solutions that are implemented across the nation in order to make sure that no firefighter ever dies like that again. For instance, a couple years ago, there was a firefighter that died in a fire because they went into the fire, he got stuck, they grabbed his jacket to try and pull him out, and his jacket actually came off of his body, and he ended up dying because he was no longer protected from exposure to the heat. And so right after that, they made everybody get new turnouts, new fire equipment that had built-in harnesses inside the protection equipment so that if something like that happened again and you needed to grab a firefighter by the collar, you grab onto a little handle that's there, and as you pull, it tightens up all around them and it's impossible to come off, and you can drag a firefighter out of the fire that way without risking pulling the jacket off. It's the same thing with nuclear meltdowns. Every time one of these things has happened, it results in widespread regulations and changes and system updates across the board to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. And because of that, today's nuclear technology virtually makes it impossible for a meltdown like any of those 3 to happen before, largely because no new nuclear reactors rely on mechanical or active cooling anymore. Many of them rely on passive cooling, which means you don't have any chance for mechanical failure to cause an overload resulting in a meltdown. So now you're saying, okay, fine. We don't have to worry about a meltdown. We don't have to worry about killing as many people as the other forms of energy. But what about all of the waste, all of the radioactive waste that we have nothing to do with and is just leaching into our environment? Well, I'm glad you brought that up. All waste ever created by all nuclear energy production in history can fit on one football field stacked 50 feet high. Now compare that to the amount of landfills that we have all across our world filled with toxic chemicals, and you see that the amount of waste that nuclear energy production produces is very, very little, especially considering the amount of waste that solar and wind produces, given their life cycles. There's really not that much in terms of volume, in terms of amount. There's not that much waste created by nuclear. Further than that, it's the only energy production waste that's actually contained and not released into the environment. All fossil fuel waste is released into the atmosphere, right, in terms of carbon and pollution. Wind turbines, they're making those giant graveyards for them, and those plastics don't break down over time. Solar panels are filled with all of those toxic chemicals and elements that have to be either, you have to invent new technologies to recycle them, or you have to fill landfills with them. And so they're leaching into our landfills, leaching into our waterways, leaching into our environment. Nuclear waste is put inside of a steel container that is then encased in concrete and stored deep underground, where even if earthquakes happen, there's not the chance for it to break out and leach at all or get into our environment whatsoever. Further than that, waste only will decrease with nuclear as technology improves. even if nuclear energy production increases, because newer reactors will be able to use what was once considered waste as their own fuel. And so as technology advances, the nuclear waste is actually going to decrease. And finally, the lifespan of the power plant itself is, technically speaking, it's infinite. As long as you stay up to date and fix your systems as they break down over time, once you build a power plant, you don't have to tear it down. And the only waste that it churns out is going to be steam, water into the atmosphere as a gas, and then the spent uranium, which we've already covered. And so that brings up the next objection. You say, okay, well, it's not clean. How can something that dangerous, radioactive, how can that be clean? Well, number one, it's carbon free, right? The way that nuclear reactors work is they take their uranium, but basically, I'm not a molecular physicist. I don't understand how these things work down at the molecular level, but basically the uranium makes water hot, and then that water turns to steam, and then that steam goes up and it turns a little turbine. Then that little turbine turns a generator to produce electricity. So the only thing that's being released into the atmosphere is literally water as steam. That's it. So obviously when you build the building with concrete and wood and you're going to use some fossil fuels to build it, but when you compare the end-to-end carbon footprint of uranium production and mining all the way to the building of the power plant, to the actual usage and production of energy, the entire life cycle of nuclear power plant production is either less than or equal to wind when you compare best case scenario and median scenarios. On to the next objection. You say, okay, well, if it was really this obvious, people would already be doing this, countries would already be doing this, and it's just too expensive. It costs too much money to build these nuclear power plants. So when you're trying to come up with energy that is both cheap, abundant, and clean, nuclear is out of the question because it's just too expensive. It's cost prohibitive. Well, it depends on your time frame. Yes, it does cost billions of dollars to build a new nuclear power plant. And yes, it does take a long time for them to break even, about 16 years on average. But once they're built, and once they're producing electricity, the fact that their maintenance cost is so low, their fuel cost is so low, and their lifespan is so long, and the fact that they're producing energy 90% of the year with very little downtime, just time for refueling basically, the ROI on nuclear power plants long term is astronomical. When you compare it to a natural gas power plant, for the first 16 years, you're going to be losing money compared to if you would have done a natural gas power plant. Because if you build a natural gas power plant, you break even in 2 years. Nuclear, you don't break even for 16 years. But by year 20, you've already surpassed every dollar and become more profitable than the natural gas plant. And obviously every year on top of that, you're making even more. So yes, the investment, the initial investment is a lot more than anything else. But when you look at things from a long-term time horizon, long-term perspective, nothing even comes close to how cheap nuclear energy is. Now, the final objection is that, hey, there's just no way that nuclear could provide enough energy for our needs now and our needs in the future. Let me put your mind to rest. It's the only thing that can. This is my water bottle. If you filled this water bottle up with uranium, this much uranium has the capacity to produce more energy, more electricity than you will ever use in your entire life. The energy density of nuclear is not even close to second place. There are only 440 nuclear power plants worldwide right now. 440. Compare that to 62,500 power plants overall of all kinds of power plants. Only 440 of the 62,500 power plants are nuclear. Guess how much they produce in terms of percentage of global electricity? 11%. 440 plants out of the total 62,500 make up 11% of total global electricity. And it's not like it's because they're taking up so much land either. The average nuclear power plant only needs 1 square mile. This means that if we wanted to build enough nuclear power plants to supply enough energy to provide the entire world with clean, abundant energy, we would only need about 4,000 more nuclear power plants. Now, I know that seems like a lot, but you're comparing that to the existing 62,500 power plants of all other sources. And they all take up far more land. They ruin far more ecosystems when you consider hydroelectric, wind farms, solar, fossil fuels. They produce more waste, they produce more pollution, they have far more of a devastating impact on their local ecosystems, and there just is not the opportunity to increase the power output for the needs of the future using those old methods as there is with nuclear. Good news time. Some countries recognize this. Some countries are waking up to the facts. These aren't opinions, they're just undeniable facts. Nuclear is clean. Nuclear is massively energy dense. It's got an extremely long lifespan. Its energy production time is about 90%. It's not reliant on the sun being out or the wind blowing. It's not reliant on an unknown quantity being left somewhere in the ground and you have to just dig deep holes to try and find it. So because of this, some countries are investing massive amounts of money into nuclear power for the future. Now, we know what happened in Europe as a result of the first industrial revolution and a new reliance on coal for energy. We know what happened in America and around the world as we went into the next industrial revolution with reliance on oil and fossil fuels to provide power for the internal combustion engine. And so we can make a pretty good guess what will happen with global prosperity and growth that will happen as a result of taking part in the nuclear revolution. And I bet you can already guess which countries are going all in on nuclear. The top 3 are going to be China, India, and Russia. Obviously, you knew that was coming. But there are many others, especially considering the population sizes. A country with even 1 or 2 or 3 nuclear power plants coming in the next 10 to 20 years will make massive differences for these countries and their ability to contribute to the global economy, their ability to be healthy, their ability to get themselves out of poverty. It's undeniable how much safer and cleaner and energy dense nuclear is. So it really is the only path forward if we want cheap and abundant energy, especially considering the fact that our energy needs into the future are expected to grow exponentially. So here's the punchline, what I know you're all waiting for: how to invest in this, how do I make money on this? Well, you've got a couple of options. Number 1, invest generally in the countries that are going all in on this. You wouldn't want to invest heavily in a market that was going all in on coal right as the world was transitioning to gasoline, natural gas, oil, things like that. You're going to miss out on better opportunities. The general boom that these countries are going to get from having access to so much energy that's clean and abundant and cheap will just be a tailwind for everything else. The technological progress, the general wealth and well-being of masses of populations, it's just going to be a huge tailwind for the growth in these countries. The second option, you can invest in nuclear power plant companies. Now, this is a little bit trickier if you are limited to publicly traded companies. So one trick that you can do is you can look up funds that invest in nuclear power plant companies and technologies. The problem is a lot of these are utilities. And if you look at utilities, especially in the West, many of these utilities companies have access or have some exposure to nuclear power plants because they're part of their grid. But companies like PG&E, they're actively getting rid of their nuclear exposure. They're shutting down their nuclear power plants. And so it's really difficult to get a pure play on nuclear technology right now if you're looking at it from the standpoint of the actual power plant. Keep your eyes open though, because going into the future, this will probably change, especially as you have utilities companies that go pure play into nuclear power production, and especially as technologies like small modular reactors gain acceptance and work better and better. Companies like this will probably go public in the future. So keep your eyes open and watch out for those types of things. And then third, which is my favorite way to play this, is to play uranium. Uranium is the fuel for nuclear power plants. So if everybody's going to dig for gold in California during the gold rush, the way to make money was to sell shovels. If the world is moving to nuclear power, the way to make money is to sell uranium. Now, if you look at a chart of uranium, or if you look at a chart of an ETF that invests in uranium miners, you might have think, I completely missed the boat. I should have invested in this a couple of months ago. It's already doubled since then. That is until you zoom out and you realize that the growth in uranium and uranium miners that we've experienced over the last couple of months, last couple of years, is absolutely nothing compared to long-term history here. And that's simply because the last couple of decades have not been kind to nuclear. So right now is a really good time because it looks like things are changing, things are transitioning, things are shifting. It's been just beaten down for decades and now looks like it's turning around. And largely that's due to, like I said, sentiment, because people are waking up to the facts about nuclear and how good of an energy source it is. The number of companies in the sector over the last 10 years or so has gone from 500 companies down to only 40 today. And so supply is massively constrained. Inventories right now are declining versus, 10, 20 years ago, they were increasing. Demand is increasing because number one, we've got 50 nuclear power plants right now that are scheduled and in production around the world, so demand is only going to go up from here. We've got power plants in the West, nuclear power plants in the West. They're not building new ones, but they're extending the lifetime. So you're looking at power plants that were supposed to be shut down, and now we're getting licenses to extend and continue to run. And so you've got more of a demand for uranium from all of these power plants that are either getting extended or new ones getting built. And it's going to take years for supply to catch up with this. Not to mention some of the call options that are represented in the nuclear space. Like I mentioned earlier, small modular reactors. These are basically tiny nuclear power plants that, if the technology is able to be perfected and regulations are passed that allow it to actually be produced, represent basically a call option where it'll massively increase demand, because you can place these things in all sorts of different areas that you can't place a regular nuclear power plant. And it just opens up the door for getting cheap, clean, abundant energy into other places. And guess what? They're going to need uranium to fuel themselves. And inventories right now in uranium are the lowest that they've been in 20 years. Right now, they're about 2 years or less across the entire sector, which is at a 20-year low. And I love what Marcelo Lopez said on a Real Vision interview recently, which is that the entire uranium market cap, the entire sector right now, is worth about $20 billion all put together. $20 billion for the entire global fuel source that supplies 11% of global energy. It's just mind-blowing, the opportunity right now to invest in uranium. Now, there's a couple different ways you can invest in uranium itself. You can invest in uranium futures if you know how to trade futures. You can invest in uranium stocks, the miners. You can invest in the companies that actually mine for uranium. And really, there are 3 ETFs that you can use as well to get exposure to uranium. You've got URA, URNM, and NLR. URA, it's a bigger ETF, but it has exposure to a lot of companies that don't have anything to do with uranium whatsoever. URNM is a much more pure play to uranium mining, refining, production. And then NLR also has exposure to some of the actual nuclear power plants as well. Like I said, as more of the world wakes up to the power of going nuclear, demand for uranium is only going to be able to increase. Even if the costs of uranium skyrocket, these power plants still have to buy it. They can't just shut themselves off. And it's not like they can switch to a different fuel source overnight either. Things like thorium reactors that their fuel is thorium instead of uranium are still far in the future. And even if costs of uranium do skyrocket, the profit margins on nuclear power plants are so enormous long term that it almost doesn't matter what the cost of uranium goes to. Power plants are still going to buy it, and it's not going to matter. So in summary, global energy transitions have always resulted in great leaps forward, each one providing massive growth for health, wealth, and the environment. Right now, we are facing the next leap forward, and it is clear 100%. No debate. The energy sources of the last century are insufficient for the needs of the future. It is also clear that energy sources like solar and wind are also woefully insufficient for the needs of the future due to the lack of energy density, the cost of production, the environmental impact on the waste, and on the installation of the vast areas of land. Nuclear is unbelievably superior to any form of energy the world has ever seen in terms of its energy density, its safety, its cost, and the total environmental impact. And fortunately, thankfully, the world is slowly waking up to these facts. This is good news because as the world goes nuclear, energy becomes clean, abundant, and cheap. This is going to launch the world forward into unimaginable growth and prosperity, just like the last few revolutions in energy production have. Well, because of this, I prefer to give myself a little bit of exposure in my investment portfolio to something as powerful as the next energy revolution. It's not investment advice, just my opinion, but it looks like this space has some tremendous upside to me. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button to help the channel out. Thank you again. Have a great day.